For those that are just joining us, we're planning a third time to presentation. Just bear with us. And looks like we're getting a fair amount of activity on our Facebook side, so that's good. Just for those who are just joining, we're going to start in about 2 minutes at 12:05. And Ian, did you want to do any kind of just like intro or something before I start, or should I just dive in at 12:05?
Yeah, I'll do a little brief thing about us and our partnership.
Awesome.
All right, well, I suppose it's 12:05, so I will do a brief little introduction. My name is Ian. I use he, him, his pronouns, and at least for this Ian, as you'll find out, there are two of us today. I am the program manager at Affirmations. We are bringing this webinar to all of you because for multiple reasons. During the coronavirus and everything like that, I think a lot of us have a lot of financial questions, things like that, that we often need answered and don't necessarily know where to turn. And also because I have been working with Ian and Michigan State University Credit Union for a little over a year now. He's been helping us with youth programming and a lot of different financial education, as well as just a lot of support from the credit union for Affirmations programming. So we wanted to be able to bring this service to any of you today who are tuning in, wanting to learn a little bit more. So I will hand it over to Ian.
Thank you, other Ian. My name is Ian Duncanson, and I'm a financial educator with MSU Federal Credit Union. We are also Oakland University Credit Union. So for those of you that are OU fans out there, we support you as well. We've got another webinar today's meeting and one on third identity theft or any additional topics through the Q&A feature, and Ian can kind of record those so we can make sure that we're offering topics that are of interest if there are other things that you want to hear about. But without further ado, I am going to go ahead and dive in with our presentation today. So we say budgeting, but I like to think of it as really spending with intention. Budgeting is kind of a dry word that makes you think of, you know, paper, spreadsheets, lots of cutting. What budgeting about is just deciding how you're going to spend your money and making sure that you're doing that intentionally. We've all probably learned about opportunity costs and the things that we don't get by making a certain decision, we're giving up something else. Your financial goals and how can you be intentional with your spending so that you're achieving the goals that you want to. So why budget? So I've got a quote at the bottom. This is actually from one of our interns from Oakland University.
Hey, Ian,
But
you're coming through a little choppy.
So that vacations you want to take. Okay, let's see. Is it a little bit better?
Still your video's a little bit choppy still, so I'm not sure.
Okay, let me. Okay, is that a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay, I've connected to my house internet, so hopefully that'll get us through.
All right.
All right. So as I was saying, budgeting isn't about what you can't have, but telling yourself what you can have and helping you reach those goals. So here's some common reasons that people budget. It could be if you have debt out there, being intentional about getting rid of that debt. One of the hardest things once you've built up debt is successfully paying it down, especially with things like credit cards. And so by having a budget and having a plan, it allows you to target paying that off with intention. Feeling more in control of your money. We've all been there where we feel like the money leaves our account as fast as it comes in, and that's not a fun feeling. Saving more money. So that could be for a number of different goals, and we'll talk through some of that. And then also just having more fun and having the money to be able to do that fun and not necessarily feel guilty about it every time you spend money. So some interesting facts. 7 out of 10 Americans have less than $1,000 in a savings account. This is according to 2019 data. So that could be even further exacerbated by our present situation. But it just goes to show that the majority of Americans don't have money in reserves for maybe an emergency expense or something that comes up. In 2019, $121 billion was paid just in credit card interest alone. So that's not paying back the purchases and the debt. That's just interest was spent on credit card debt. And credit cards tend to have the highest interest rate of any loan. So it adds up kind of quickly there. And then also 4 out of 10 Americans who use credit cards do carry a debt month to month. So the best way to avoid paying interest is simply to pay the new balance every time you get your credit card statement. But many Americans, many people end up paying either just the minimum payment or some amount less than that total balance. And that creates kind of an issue with, you know, then you're carrying that debt, adding to it potentially, and paying interest on it while you're doing that. So getting started for building a budget, the first thing is to set some financial goals. So Is there something that you want to save for? Maybe it's building an emergency fund. Maybe it's taking a vacation somewhere. Whatever those financial goals are, maybe it's paying off debt. Just being clear about what are the top maybe 2 or 3 goals that you have in building your budget, and that can help to motivate you as you move forward. Then you're going to write down all of your expenses. So taking into account all of the fixed expenses, variable expenses, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Getting organized with actually looking at, where is my money going? It's really hard to estimate, for example, how much I spend on going out to eat during a month. But if I actually look at my debit card or my credit card history, I'm able to add up what I've been spending as a habit and really see where the money is going. And then find a way to budget that suits you. So don't try and do a Microsoft Excel budget if you really hate Microsoft Excel. If you don't like what you're doing, you're not going to stick with it. In this context, I think of budgeting almost like dieting, in that if you develop something that's really unsustainable, that makes you miserable, it's not going to last very long. And that's not what we want. So find something that works for you based on your personality. So before we dive into the more specifics, I want to talk about the different types of spenders. So we have 6 different types of spenders. And after I go through these and share mine, Ian's going to push out a poll where you can share which one you think you identify with. First up, we have the giver. So the giver is someone who gives significant amounts of money to others, maybe family, maybe friends, and it can be a hindrance to actually reaching financial goals, because every time you have a little bit of extra money to reach those goals, it's being given to someone else who's asking for it, needs it, etc. So yes, it's important to help other people, but you always want to be careful about, am I putting myself at financial risk by helping somebody else? Next is the planner. So they generally plan out how all of the money is going to be spent. So having listed, here's the money that I have coming in, and I'm going to put this amount to groceries, I'm going to put this amount to going out to eat, and then is very intentional about how that money will be spent. The third is the merger. So a merger is where you maybe have your finances merged with another person. So maybe that's someone in your economic unit, like a spouse or a family member who lives with you. It could also be, someone who doesn't live with you that you have merged your finances with and just kind of take things as they come. Could be a roommate, any of those things. Fourth is a hoarder. So a hoarder, we often think of someone who hoards a lot of knickknacks and things like that and hangs on to those. But the same can be true of money in some cases, where you're not spending any money and holding on to everything. And in some cases, that can mean that you're focused so much on being frugal that you feel guilty every time you spend any money on something for enjoyment. Then there's the separatist. So the separatist prefers to have all of their money separate from any other person's, and even separate from their own money in some cases. So this could be separating out, savings for an emergency into a particular account, and saving for your next car in another account, and saving for your rent payment in another account. So separating out the purposes of each portion of money that goes into each of those accounts. And that can be sub-savers within the same account, or having multiple accounts at different financial institutions that all have different purposes. And then the infamous YOLO, which is someone who has little regard for saving, the idea that I make it so I can spend it. And so people who fall into that YOLO category oftentimes don't have any money in savings, because when they have the money, they spend the money. So a little bit, Ian's pushing this poll out, and while you're answering that, I'll talk a little bit about where I identify, because truthfully, many of us probably fall into multiple categories for this. I kind of oscillate a little bit between the planner and the separatist. So I like to plan out a specific monthly budget for how much I'm allowing myself to spend in a certain category. And then I kind of track it at different points through the month to subtract how much I've spent and see where I'm at. That helps me get a picture of, am I overspending? Am I underspending? Not that underspending is a bad thing, but kind of knowing if there's cushion or if I need to scale it back a bit. And then with Separatist, I do like to, for the sake of budgeting, I have, sub accounts within my main account at the credit union for things like rent or for travel. I put a little bit of money aside for travel in case I'm going to go somewhere, buy a plane ticket, something like that. And so I have a number of different categories that I kind of separate my money out to. And currently I don't have anyone that I'm merged with. And so it's very easy for me to keep those things separate and kind of have an idea of, do I have the money for the specific things that I need? So let's see how we're doing here on the poll. It looks like, and we just have one participant in the Zoom to answer, but looks like we have a separatist among us. So it's nice to see a fellow separatist here. Ian, did you want to share how you feel you identify?
Yeah, I think I fluctuate kind of between the giver and the YOLO. If I have it, I like to use it, but I also like to use it mostly on other people.
Awesome. Yeah, so obviously, as you heard me describing these, there's some benefits and some drawbacks to all of them. So there is no one right way to spend, but you know yourself the best, and kind of identifying how you spend money can help you when you think about, okay, how am I going to reach my financial goals? What am I going to need to control while I'm budgeting to make sure that I have the money for the things that I need and that I allow myself some money for the things that I want? So some tips when you are thinking about building your budget. The biggest thing is to just get started. A lot of people stop right at the idea of having to start listing things down because they feel a little bit anxious about what the end result is going to be. The reality is the numbers are the numbers. So not ignoring them is not going to change your financial situation. Whereas if you actually write them down, doesn't mean that you have to make some drastic overhaul of everything you're doing. It just gives you a picture of where your starting point is and gives you some clues as to what you can do to improve your progress towards your goals moving forward. Anyone can budget, so doesn't matter what situation you're in. If you have any kind of income, whether that's from a job, whether that's unemployment right now, I know a lot of people are claiming that in our current circumstances. If you have Social Security money coming in, disability money coming in, anything that you have coming in is your money to budget. Even for college students, we often talk about how their student loan refund, if they have any student loan refund, that's kind of their money to use to live off of during that time, and they need to be able to budget that. And then make sure that you're including everyone in your unit. So anyone that's going to be influencing your money, you want to make sure that you're factoring them in and kind of talking through what your plan is moving forward. So if you have a spouse and you build a budget and you start making changes but don't really talk to them about it, it can be very difficult to meet your goals because your spouse may be spending outside of that budget that you've set, which could throw off your own numbers and cause some frustration. Similarly, if you've got kids, we all know kids are expensive and they have demands and they have wants and they have needs. And so talking to them about your strategy not only helps you achieve your goals, but helps them understand the reasoning behind what you're doing. And in many cases, even helps them become better budgeters because they're learning from you that this is how you process your money. This is how you take control of your financial goals. All right, I'll go through one more here and then I'll pause in case we have any questions or anything like that. So the main steps when you're building your budget, step one is to track your expenses. So I like to list all the expenses separate from my income, just because a lot of times if you try and start with income and subtract expenses from that, we have a tendency to make it match. And so we assume that things must be about equal, and so we kind of underestimate or overestimate income, underestimate expenses and things like that. So track your expenses. Look at your debit card history, your credit card history. If you spend a lot in cash, then maybe keeping receipts is going to be a good tool, just to kind of see for the past month or so what seems to kind of be the trend. We all know that things fluctuate. So I know over the last month, I've spent more on online shopping because I'm sitting at home. And so the tendency can be easier to spend money in some circumstances. So it is flexible, which is why it's important to look at maybe a couple months of history. Step 2 is to write down all of the income that you have coming in and all of the expenses that you have going out, which you just tracked in the previous step. With regard to income, I like to always mention that if you regularly get overtime, overtime is not a good idea to count in your budget, simply for the fact that if overtime suddenly becomes unavailable and you've built your budget around that, it can tighten things up really quickly. And that happened to me one summer working at the credit union. I was working a ton of overtime helping out in our call center. And then halfway through the summer, the opportunities for that overtime kind of disappeared because we had enough staff and call volume, et cetera, adjusted. And so I didn't have that additional overtime income at the time, but had built a habit of spending using that extra money. So it's always better to think of overtime as something a little bit extra rather than an expectation as part of your budget. Step 3, you take the income you got and subtract expenses, which leads you to step 4, where do you stand? So if that leaves you with a positive number, that means you probably have money left over and are doing a good job of saving. If you end up with a negative number, that means you're spending more than is coming in, which likely means that you're building up debt in some form on a credit card or having to seek additional assistance. So not ideal, or breaking even, which is kind of that middle group of people who live paycheck to paycheck, where the money is coming in and it's gone by the time the next paycheck arrives. And so you're eagerly awaiting that next paycheck. If you get this number and it doesn't feel right, feel free to go back and adjust. See, did you miss some income? Did you overestimate your income? With expenses, did you maybe forget about something or underestimate something there? If you don't have a clear picture, it's not really going to help you. And this number, whether it's positive, negative, break even, is not meant to make you feel good or bad about anything. It's just meant to give you a marker of here's where I have been in the past, so I know what adjustments I need to make going forward. Step 5 is to adjust any expenses as necessary. So I think it's always important to be specific when you're listing out your expenses. So if you're someone who goes for coffee 5 days a week, that's probably worth being separated from just your normal going out to eat expenses, because a significant amount of money is then being spent just on that one thing. And it helps give you a picture of where that money is going, so that you can make a reasonable adjustment, see, does this make sense? Is this fair? Am I willing to give part of that up or adjust some of that? And then step 6 is to kind of create your budget with those numbers. And I'll have a sample budget sheet that I'll show at the end just to kind of illustrate this point. The main thing is when I say adjust expenses, it doesn't mean cutting something out completely. It means making an adjustment. So if, take the coffee example, I'm someone who I have to have coffee every day. But I, instead of going to Starbucks every day, I make coffee at home for most days of the week. And then I allow myself, maybe 1 or 2 days that I grab coffee somewhere else. So allowing yourself to still have the things that you like while reducing some of the expenses elsewhere. All right, do we have any questions yet, Ian?
I have not received any yet, no.
Okay. And I'm kind of keeping an eye on the live. So if any questions come through on there, we'll be happy to answer those as well.
Awesome.
All right, so I talked a little bit about these, but there's different types of expenses to take into consideration. So fixed expenses There are costs that does not change month to month or only changes very slightly. So an example of a fixed expense would be rent. I don't get to negotiate my rent each month. I know how much I owe, I know when it's due, and so there are no surprises. Another example could even be like a gym membership. You sign up for it, and that doesn't mean you can't cancel or change it, but you know when it's due, you know how much is due, and it's due every month. Things like Netflix, any streaming subscriptions, or clothing subscription boxes, any of that type of stuff, music subscriptions, anything that's going to be automatic every month, even things like utilities, so paying your electric or your water bill. Those are going to fluctuate, but you know when it's going to be due, and you know generally how much to expect for the bill, even if there are slight fluctuations. So those are all your fixed expenses that you can anticipate. Your variable expenses are things that change depending on your habits. So this could be groceries. Maybe you spend more some months, less other months. I know I've been spending a lot more on groceries now that we're all at home. So that has changed a lot for me this month, but I've been able to adjust that with my dining out budget, which would be another variable expense. Since I'm not going out to eat as much anymore, I have more money available for groceries. Some other variable expenses could be entertainment, like going to concerts or going to movies, or which I know a lot of us are not doing right now, but those are still examples that would fit into that category. Gas for my car, that's another one that fluctuates. I normally drive 30 miles each way to get to and from work. Right now, I'm not driving very much at all. And so as a result, my expenses for gas have gone down, which also pads my grocery budget a little bit more. And then the third is unexpected things, anything that's you didn't plan on but is necessary. So that could be a medical bill. It could be a flat tire that you have to get repaired. It could be something happening with a family member who needs help. There's any number of situations that could fall into that. And so the best thing that you can do is figure out anything that you can plan on so that you minimize those unexpected things. One example I'll give for that is like car insurance. So I pay my car insurance in a 6-month chunk instead of paying each month. Because I do that, I get a significant discount for prepaying that 6 months all at once. The problem is, since I'm not paying that every month, if I'm not putting any money aside for it, then when that 6 months comes due and I've got to pay that full bill, that could take me off guard. That could kind of disrupt my budget in that moment, because suddenly now I've got to come up with all of this money to pay that 6 months of insurance. Whereas if I move that over into a fixed expense and just divvy it up and I'm saving for it each month, then when the time comes, I have the money already set aside to be able to make that expense. And for me, unfortunately, my 6 months of car insurance often comes at the same time as I have to pay for my car registration for the year. And then typically my apartment leases are up around that same period. So if I'm moving, I've now got to also come up with money for my new security deposit and first month's rent and all of that. So it's just about thinking, okay, what things do I have coming up that even though they're not right now an expense, they will be, and can I start putting aside money for those in advance? So some tips, some additional tips, be specific. So I alluded to this earlier, create categories for your expenses as they make sense. The more detailed you can be, the better. If you're someone who loves playing video games, if you're someone who loves going to the farmer's market, if whatever that thing is that that you spend more money on, make sure that you're giving that its own category so that you can look at the total amount being spent there. Be realistic, so don't underestimate how much you're spending. Like I said, if it's inaccurate, it's not going to help you. And on the same front, don't overestimate your income. Be realistic on what you can count on. Be consistent, so budget every month or payday. Some people get paid monthly or look at their budget based on a month because rent is due each month, utilities are due each month, etc. But I like to look at my budget every 2 weeks when I get paid, because that's another opportunity for me to take the money that's coming in and divvy it up towards the bills that I have currently or have coming up. And so it allows me, for example, to pay half of my rent out of each paycheck instead of paying the entirety of a month's rent from one single paycheck. And that kind of evens out my expenses. The way I do that is I have a sub savings called rent, and I just transfer half of the cost of rent in there out of one paycheck, transfer the other half out of the next paycheck, and then I can just pay my rent directly from that account. So it allows me to divvy that up and make my budget a little bit more even throughout the month. And then lastly, be flexible and recognize that your budget will change. So as I mentioned, right now, a lot of us are experiencing changes in how much gas we use, how much we spend on groceries, how much we spend on going out to eat or entertainment and all of those things. So that's why it's important to be consistent and to look at your budget regularly, is because things do change and you want to be able to tweak those numbers. No one budget is just going to work indefinitely for anyone, no matter what. There's always going to be some changes and things like that that you want to be able to tweak throughout. So when we talk about some of the savings goals, one of the ways that helps with that is paying yourself first. So this is the idea. We talk about this in every level of budgeting, paying yourself. We spend so much time paying bills and paying other people, but we don't often think about paying ourselves. That really is just another way to say saving money. So, and paying yourself first is this idea of making it a priority. So I personally view saving as like a fixed expense. When I build it into my budget, it is a non-negotiable expense that is part of what I do with my money. So as soon as I get paid, a specific amount automatically goes into my savings accounts. So why do I do this? Why is this important to view it that way? It allows you to save for larger purchases. It's helpful in case of unexpected expenses, and it helps you save towards the future or towards specific goals that you might have. And we talked about some of those goals earlier, but making it automatic ensures that it happens. Unfortunately, I see two common mistakes with saving that really hinder people's ability to do it. The first one is that they figure, okay, I'm going to pay all my bills and then I'm going to save some money out of what's left. Or after I, get to the end of the week and I've paid the things that I need to pay, then I'll transfer some money to savings. The problem with that oftentimes is that money gets too easily spent, and then there's nothing that goes into savings, and you kind of feel like maybe the next time I'll be able to do that. So making it a priority, even if it's just a small dollar amount or a small percentage of what you get paid, helps to ensure that it happens. The second common mistake I see is that people will have all of their paychecks or all of their income direct deposited into their savings account. The idea behind that is if I put it all in savings, I'm not going to spend it. What I then see is people then are transferring money into their checking account, transferring it into checking account in order to pay bills, in order to use their debit card, etc. And because it's being drawn from so frequently, that savings quickly gets depleted because it's not really separated. So I encourage you with your accounts, if you have a savings and a checking account, to really use that checking account as the place to start with having your money go. And then use the savings account as a deliberate place to save money that you don't want to touch for other purposes. So if you're transferring, say, $20 out of every paycheck into savings to not touch, then transfer that into your standard savings account out of the checking account, rather than trying to put it all in the same pot and then avoid spending any of it. It allows you to be a little bit more intentional about that. So when we talk about some of these goals, we like to talk about SMART goals. So SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And so you want things that you're actually capable of doing and that have kind of a timeline in place that will help you move towards that goal, rather than just kind of having an endless goal of one day I want to buy a new car. And so I'm going to save a random amount of money for that car. So an example that we have here, a goal might be just a down payment on a car. So let's say you want to save $2,000. Your deadline, and this is a little bit outdated here in terms of the dates. So let's fast forward this a year and say you want to buy a year from now. So your deadline would be May of 2021. Your start date then could be May of 2020. So you're going to start right now. That would give you 12 months to save. If you divide that $2,000 by the 12 months you have to save, that means that you would have to save $166.67 per month. Now, a way to reach that goal, there's a number of different things, but just an example. So let's say I get paid biweekly, and so every 2 weeks, I'm going to put aside $83.33 into a savings account for that purpose of that car. So that breaks it down into a smaller increment and gives you a plan to get there. Ways to reach goal doesn't just have to be, transferring biweekly. So the second example here, maybe you want to take a vacation. Let's say, okay, so you want to go again. To fast forward it for this time frame. Let's say you want to go in May of 2022, and you're going to start this month in May of 2020. That would give you 24 months to save, meaning that you would need $125 per month. And one example of ways to get that $125 a month might be picking up some extra shifts at work, might be reducing the number of times that you go out to eat, or I've even seen examples of, like, going back to the coffee example, of every time you buy a coffee, you put an equal amount into savings, so that you're feeling that expense a little bit more and also working towards your goals.
And we did have a question over on Facebook regarding credit, actually.
Sure. What was the question?
So Ray asked about that if you make all of your payments on time for a credit card, how does that affect your credit score?
So that's a good question. And I'd be happy to do a full presentation on credit at some point in the future if people have interest in that. But the short answer to that is the biggest factor in your credit score is making on-time payments. And on-time payments is recorded as long as you make the minimum payment. So you don't have to pay off your credit card in order to be considered making on-time payments. You just have to make at least the minimum payment that's stated on your credit card statement. That will help build your credit by recording on-time payments. However, the second biggest factor in your credit score is the amount that you owe relative to your credit limit. So it's in your interest to keep your credit cards paid down, because if you keep the balance low relative to what your credit limit is, that's also going to help positively impact your credit score. So if you max out your credit card and you're making all the payments on time, it's kind of like an in the middle, because you're making all your payments on time, which is really good for your score. It's the most important factor. But if your card is maxed out at its limit, then that's going to drag on your score because you don't have anything available. So there's a couple different factors there, but definitely always making at least the minimum payment is the best place that you want to be in, because missing a payment is going to damage your score up to 100 points. And so you really want to make sure that you're at least making those minimum payments if possible. Good question. All right, so here are just a couple fun options to save. Some of them may be realistic or not realistic, but we just like to give some examples of things that might help motivate you to save. So one of them, I talked about this a little bit a second ago, is the latte challenge. So save the amount of money that you regularly spend on buying lattes or buying coffees. So the average cost is about $4, and that depends. There are obviously ones that are $6 or $7, and there's ones that $2 or $3. So we just put an average of 4. Let's say you buy it 4 times a week. That means that over the course of a year, you're spending $830 just on coffee. So one way to approach this would be to maybe cut that in half and save, half of that money, or to do what I mentioned earlier, and just every time you buy a coffee, you put an equal amount of money into a savings account so that you're both saving and buying the thing that you like at the same time. Another example is the 52-week challenge. So you would save the dollar amount for each week of the year. You could really start at any point. So if you were going to start this week, you'd put $1 into savings. Next week, you'd put $2. The following week, you'd put $3. It can get a little bit challenging when you get up to weeks 40 through 52, and you've got to come up with that amount of money to put into savings. So some people like to kind of work backwards from the time maybe they get their tax return or something like that, and they have a little bit more money to do those larger amounts. But in doing that, you'd have over $1,300 in a savings account at the end of a year. And then another fun one is the change challenge. So it's save a nickel today and a dime tomorrow. So each day of the year, you increase the amount you save by just 5 cents. And on day 365, that single day savings is $18.25. And doing that for a full year would give you over $3,300 in savings. So again, might not be realistic for your particular situation, but they can be fun ways to at least get started building savings. And that can sometimes help encourage you to continue on with it. So it is, tax deadlines are changing a little bit. Some of you may have already gotten tax refunds. Some of you may be expecting them. But it's always important to kind of maximize that refund because it can easily get absorbed by other things if it's not used intentionally. So a few ideas that can maximize that impact are paying debts. So getting current on any bills that are delinquent, which is just another way to say past due. Paying extra on any current bills, especially credit cards. They have the highest interest rates. So if you can pay extra on those to get those paid down, you actually save the most money in interest. And so if you figure I have a credit card that's at, say, 20% interest, that's going to save you a lot more money paying that debt off than perhaps putting that into a savings account where you might only be earning 1 or 2%. Again, you want to think about emergency expenses and do you have enough of a cushion? You don't want to get rid of all of it, but when you're paying down debts, paying that high interest rate debt is going to save you the most money. So maybe you don't have a lot of debt that you want, or you want to put some of it into savings. So you can open a certificate, or banks call them certificates of deposit. You can choose how long you want to put that money away for. You earn a little bit extra in interest on it because you're putting it away for a specified period of time. So you could do something short-term or long-term, depending on what your goals are. You could save it for future large purchases, like maybe you were saving for that car down payment, and now you have a big boon of money that you can put a little bit extra into that will speed up your timeline for getting that car. Or creating an emergency savings if you don't have one, trying to get some amount of money. And there's all sorts of recommendations of you should have 6 months of expenses. And while that would be great, that's not always realistic for everyone to come up with. So starting with any amount that's in an emergency savings is going to be helpful. The key thing with emergency savings is to be regularly adding to it so that when that emergency comes and you have to take some out, you still have some left over and you don't have to start from zero. Make sure that and this is true even with a stimulus check. If any of you got those stimulus checks, similar with a tax refund, don't sign up for anything that you cannot afford normally as a subscription or something that's going to be a recurring expense. Don't double your cable or double your internet bill or things like that you wouldn't otherwise already be able to spend, because once that money is gone, you're still going to have that expense. And if you're tied to some sort of contract for that, it can make it more expensive to come out the other end. Take a little bit of the money and treat yourself to something fun. Don't over splurge and blow all of the money. It tends to go a lot quicker than it comes in. And then kind of think of the tax return, or for those of you that maybe got a stimulus check and are still working and have other income, think of it as a time to get ahead rather than free money to blow on anything. So some additional resources that we have regarding budgeting. We have a mobile app called Financial 4.0. There's an MSU and OU version. They have the same content on there, so you could choose whichever your pleasure. It's completely free, and it's not our normal credit union mobile app. So it's not talking about our products and services. It's not signing into your account or telling you to open a new account, anything like that. It's purely financial literacy based. And within that, we have subcategories for things like credit. If you want to learn more about credit, that we're putting out content constantly about credit. Identity theft, which we're going to cover later this week. We have a whole section on fraud and identity theft. Budgeting, which we covered today. We have a whole section called Budgeting Like a Boss. So there's different things to do with budgeting on there. Completely free anywhere that you download mobile apps. I encourage you to check that out. It is also a website at financial40.org. It's run by our financial education team. And there's even a feature with both the app and website to submit financial questions. I will give the caveat that a lot of the content is targeted towards college aged, but when you think about the stuff that's in the credit and budgeting and so forth categories, identity theft, investing, we even have an investing basics, all of that information is really applicable at any age. So I'm sure that you'd find something valuable on there. For specific issues, if you're having issues with debt management or want some specific financial counseling, we work and refer people to GreenPath. They're a nonprofit organization that will give free consultations and talk through most of their services are free. The only time that I'm aware of that any money comes into play is if you ask them to set up an actual debt management plan where they're contacting creditors and making payments on your behalf. Annualcreditreport.com is a great resource to view your credit report, since that was brought up. So typically you're able to view a credit report from Experian, from Equifax, and from TransUnion once per rolling year. So you could either pull all three, or you could pull a different one maybe every 4 months and get a year-round picture. And actually, in the wake of the coronavirus, they've actually increased the frequency so that now you can get a free copy of your credit report from them every week through at least April of 2021. And those credit reports are, the only reason we give this website is it's actually a government mandated website. So they're not trying to sell you on credit cards or sell you on accounts and loans and services. It is completely authentic. It gives you the real information, and it's comprehensive. So you can see everything that you might want to see. A lot of people have asked, is Credit Karma okay? Yeah, Credit Karma gives you a lot of information, but it does miss out on some information that you would get from these reports. And the only reason that Credit Karma is free is because they're paid by credit card companies and loan companies to tell you about pre-approvals and to try and get you to open things. So I urge you to use caution with that in terms of some of the recommendations that Credit Karma can give you. And the score that you see on Credit Karma is often a little bit different than what you're going to see if you actually go into a financial institution and apply for something. And then lastly, we have a podcast called Wallet Watch. If you really like podcasts, again, it's not promotional. We talk about things like credit, budgeting. We've had getting ready for job interviews. We've interviewed financial aid professionals at Michigan State and at Oakland University. We've interviewed admissions. There's a lot of really cool things on there. So I encourage you to check that out if you like podcasts. And the episodes are only like 12 to 15 minutes a piece. So they're not super long episodes, but really good content on there as well. All right, does anyone have any additional questions? And then I will share the budgeting sheet that I've got as well. Have you seen any questions come through, Ian?
I have not seen any.
Looks like our participant is no longer here on here, but I don't know about on Facebook, perhaps.
There are definitely still people watching on Facebook, but no comments.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and bring up for those that are watching, I'm going to bring up the sample budgeting document that I have. So this is just a basic budgeting sheet that I kind of threw together. You can find similar types of things anywhere online, but it kind of walks through the first box there, calculating your income. So it's important to use your net pay rather than your gross income. So that means your after tax money, because that's the money that you actually have to work with for your budget. Parental support if you're receiving any help from family members, parents, etc. If you're in school and you're receiving a scholarship or financial aid, if you have any kind of stipend, again, you could put in Social Security, you could put unemployment, anything that you have coming in. You just want to make sure that you're using the after-tax money. So this is money you know that you can spend. Then with your fixed expenses, so I gave the example of rent. Some other examples might be car insurance if you pay that monthly, a car loan, student loan, cell phone, internet and cable, gym membership, and then anything else that you might think of. The variable expenses, we talked about kind of all of these: dining out, groceries, gas, entertainment, and shopping or clothing. You might have other variable expenses to fill in there. And then the final budget, you're taking your income, subtracting your expenses, both fixed and variable, and that gives what's called your disposable income. So if that's a positive number, that means you have money that is considered disposable income that you could use for something else. If it's negative, then you kind of want to take a look back and see what things you might be able to adjust. I then have savings on there. But as I mentioned, I like to put savings over as a fixed expense. And so for me, I tend to list it over as a fixed expense at the beginning. So this is just kind of an example. So that's all that I've got for today. If there are no other questions or anything like that, then we will be back on Thursday. And I don't see anything else. So, all right. Well, thank you for those of you that attended and watched. We will be back on Thursday evening at 5 p.m. for a presentation about fraud and identity theft.
All right. Thank you all for being here, and we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Ian.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.